My name is Haley Thompson. I'm 29 years old, and 8 years ago, my own parents destroyed my life to protect their lies. Now I stood in the Cedar Falls courthouse, watching their smug faces turn to absolute horror as Judge Morrison recognized me not as their defender, but as the federal prosecutor who would send them to prison. The same parents who once called me their golden child were about to learn that the daughter they betrayed had become their worst nightmare. Dad's confident smirk vanished when I opened my briefcase, and Mom's face went white as she realized the truth. Before we dive into this story of betrayal and justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how family loyalty became my greatest weakness and my ultimate strength, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama stories. Trust me, you won't believe what my own flesh and blood put me through, or how I turned their betrayal into their downfall. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I thought I had hit the lottery when it came to parents. Richard and Linda Thompson were the town's golden couple, successful real estate developers who built half the subdivisions in our county. Our house on Maple Street was the biggest in the neighborhood, with its wraparound porch and perfectly manicured lawn that made every other family jealous. I was their pride and joy, the daughter who brought home straight A's, won debate tournaments, and got accepted to Northwestern Law School with a full scholarship. But success in a small town comes with expectations, and my parents made sure I understood mine from an early age. Every achievement was publicly celebrated, not just for my benefit, but to enhance their reputation as the family that had it all together. When I graduated summa cum laude from law school, Dad threw a party at the country club where he made sure everyone knew his daughter was going to be a big-shot lawyer. What I didn't realize then was how much they needed that legitimacy for their business dealings. The first crack in my perfect world appeared during my second year of law school, when I came home for spring break. Dad had asked me to review some contracts for Thompson Development, nothing too serious, just a daughter helping out the family business. I was flattered that he trusted my legal knowledge enough to ask for my opinion. The documents seemed standard enough, though some of the financial projections looked overly optimistic. When I mentioned this to Dad, he brushed off my concerns with a laugh, saying I was being too careful, too academic in my thinking. That summer, I worked as an intern at their office, helping organize files and learning the real estate business from the ground up. It was then that I discovered the first set of falsified documents hidden in a filing cabinet that was supposed to be locked. Purchase agreements with inflated property values, bank statements that didn't match the copies I'd seen earlier, and investor contracts promising returns that seemed mathematically impossible. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. The confrontation with my parents that evening was the beginning of the end of my relationship with them. I laid out the documents on our dining room table, the same table where we'd celebrated every one of my academic achievements, and asked them to explain what I'd found. Dad's face turned red with anger, not shame, and he accused me of being ungrateful and naive about how business really worked. Mom stood behind him, literally and figuratively, telling me I was too young to understand the complexities of their industry. When I threatened to report what I'd found to the authorities, they showed their true colors. Dad slammed his fist on the table and told me I was either with the family or against it, but that I couldn't be both. Mom, with tears in her eyes that I now know were fake, begged me not to destroy everything they'd worked for over my academic idealism. They made it clear that my legal education meant nothing if I couldn't understand loyalty to family. Their first betrayal came swift and brutal. Within a week, they had cut off all financial support, telling me I was on my own since I wanted to be so independent and righteous. But worse than the money was the whisper campaign they launched against me. Suddenly, family friends were calling my professors, expressing concern about my mental state. Old family friends crossed the street to avoid talking to me when I was home for what turned out to be my last visit for 8 years. The breaking point came when I overheard Mom on the phone with her sister, describing me as having some kind of breakdown and needing professional help, because I was making wild accusations about their business. That was when I realized they weren't just cutting me off financially, they were systematically destroying my reputation to protect themselves. The parents who had once bragged about my accomplishments were now spreading lies that I was mentally unstable. I left Cedar Falls with 2 suitcases and $300 to my name, working 3 jobs while finishing my final year of law school. Nights at a 24-hour diner, weekends cleaning office buildings, and early mornings tutoring undergraduates for extra cash. Every dollar I earned felt like a small victory against the people who thought they could break me by taking away their support. My grades never slipped, though, because I'd learned that my success was the best revenge against people who expected me to fail. After graduation, I moved to Chicago and started at the bottom of a small firm that specialized in financial crimes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd found my calling in prosecuting exactly the kind of fraud my parents were committing. Every case I won felt like preparation for a confrontation I knew would come eventually. I just never imagined it would take 8 years. The anonymous tip arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, slipped under my office door like a ghost from my past. A manila envelope with no return address, containing photocopies of bank statements, investment agreements, and a handwritten note that simply said, "Thompson Development is stealing from retirees. Someone needs to stop them." My hands shook as I recognized my parents' business letterhead and realized that my worst fears about their operations had not only been justified, but had apparently grown into something much worse. The documents revealed a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had been operating for at least 12 years, targeting elderly investors throughout rural Iowa with promises of guaranteed returns on property developments that existed only on paper. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its scope. My parents would sell shares in fake development projects, using money from new investors to pay earlier ones while skimming enormous amounts for themselves. The projected victim count was staggering, with over 200 families having invested their life savings. What made my stomach turn was discovering how they'd been using my name and early legal involvement to legitimize their operations. Those contracts I'd reviewed during law school, the ones Dad had dismissed my concerns about, had been modified after my review to include a note that they'd been vetted by Northwestern law student Haley Thompson. My signature, which I'd innocently provided on a few documents I thought were routine, had been forged onto dozens of others, creating a paper trail that made it look like I'd been complicit in their fraud from the beginning. The investigation revealed the full extent of their manipulation, and my parents' calculating cruelty. Among the victims were families I'd known growing up, people who had trusted the Thompsons because they were pillars of the community. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had invested her late husband's pension. The Kowalski family had put their farm up as collateral for what they thought was a sure-thing investment. My high school math teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, had cashed out his retirement account to invest with my parents, trusting them because they were Haley's successful parents. The second betrayal cut deeper than the first, because it revealed the premeditated nature of their deception. Not only had they forged my signature on multiple documents, but they'd also created fake email accounts in my name to communicate with some investors. The FBI forensics team found dozens of emails where someone claiming to be me vouched for Thompson Development's legitimacy and financial soundness. They had literally stolen my identity to commit fraud, turning their own daughter into an unwitting accomplice. My brother Jake's involvement was perhaps the most devastating discovery. 3 years younger than me, he'd always been the golden boy who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. While I'd been working 3 jobs to pay for law school, he'd been living comfortably at home, supposedly helping run the family business. What I learned was that he'd been a full participant in their scheme, helping forge documents and create fake property assessments. The little brother I'd protected and defended throughout our childhood had known everything about what our parents were doing and had actively helped them destroy people's lives. When I tried to reach out to old friends in Cedar Falls to gauge community sentiment about my parents, I discovered that their reputation management had been thorough and ongoing. The story they'd been telling for 8 years was that I'd had a mental breakdown in law school and had become obsessed with trying to destroy them out of spite and jealousy. Former friends either hung up on me or told me they hoped I'd gotten the help I needed, and that I should leave my family alone. The narrative they'd constructed painted me as the disturbed daughter, who couldn't handle not being the center of attention anymore. The community's reaction to my parents when the federal investigation became public was initially one of disbelief and support for them. Local newspaper coverage portrayed them as victims of a federal overreach, with quotes from community leaders defending their character and questioning the motives of their accusers. The fact that their own daughter was leading the prosecution was used as evidence that this was a personal vendetta, rather than a legitimate legal case. Letters to the editor praised my parents' community contributions and suggested that any investigation was politically motivated. The weight of prosecuting my own parents while being portrayed as a vindictive daughter nearly broke me during those early weeks of the investigation. There were nights when I lay awake questioning whether I was doing the right thing, wondering if maybe I should have just stayed away from Cedar Falls and let someone else handle the case. The isolation was crushing, being treated as both the prosecutor seeking justice and the disgruntled family member seeking revenge. But every time I looked at the victim statements, every time I read about elderly people losing their homes because they'd trusted my parents with their life savings, I knew I had to see it through. The turning point came when I realized that my parents' greatest weapon against me, their character assassination campaign, was also their greatest vulnerability. They had been so focused on discrediting me personally that they'd ignored the mountain of financial evidence building against them. While they were busy telling everyone I was mentally unstable, they were still actively defrauding new victims and leaving an electronic trail that would ultimately convict them. Their arrogance and belief in their own immunity would become the foundation of their downfall. The moment my parents realized I was serious about prosecuting them, their campaign against me shifted from whispered rumors to open warfare. They hired Marcus Webb, the most aggressive defense attorney in the state, a man whose reputation for destroying prosecutors' credibility was legendary throughout Iowa's legal community. Within days of his hiring, my personal life became an open book as Webb's investigators dug into every aspect of my past, searching for ammunition to use against me in court. The third betrayal was the most personally devastating because it involved someone I'd once loved. Brian Morrison, my college boyfriend and the judge's son, had been the one relationship I'd thought was genuine and untainted by my family's influence. We'd dated for 2 years, and I'd believed he was the one person who cared about me for myself rather than my family's money or status. The FBI investigation revealed that throughout our relationship, he'd been receiving monthly payments from my parents to report on my activities, my emotional state, and my plans after graduation. Reading through the documentation of Brian's betrayal felt like reliving our entire relationship through a lens of deception. Every intimate conversation we'd had, every moment when I'd confided my fears about my family, every plan we'd made for our future together had been reported back to my parents in detailed monthly reports. The worst part was discovering that his sudden breakup with me, which had devastated me at the time, had been orchestrated by my parents who were worried I was getting too serious about someone they couldn't control. Webb's strategy became clear as former college friends began contacting me with apologies and warnings. My parents had reached out to them, not directly, but through intermediaries who claimed to be conducting a character assessment for a family legal matter. These friends were being asked about my behavior in college, whether they'd ever seen me act irrationally or violently, and whether I'd ever made threats against my family. The questions were designed to elicit responses that could be twisted into evidence of mental instability or a pattern of aggressive behavior toward my parents. The harassment escalated beyond legal maneuvering into personal intimidation tactics that made me fear for my physical safety. Anonymous phone calls to my hotel room at all hours of the night, sometimes with just heavy breathing, sometimes with whispered threats about dropping the case or facing consequences. My rental car's tires were slashed twice in the hotel parking lot, and the mirror in my room was broken with a rock thrown through the window while I slept. The local police were sympathetic, but clearly uncomfortable investigating crimes that might implicate the town's most prominent family. My parents' most calculated move was filing a restraining order against me, claiming that I'd been stalking them and making threatening phone calls despite having had no contact with them for 8 years before the investigation began. The affidavit they filed painted a picture of a mentally unstable daughter who had become dangerous and obsessed with destroying her family because they'd refused to enable her delusions. The fact that I was staying in a hotel 20 miles away from their house was cited as evidence that I was lurking in the area with malicious intent. The local newspaper, the Cedar Falls Gazette, published a front-page story titled "Prominent Family Targeted by Estranged Daughter's Vendetta" that was clearly based on information provided by my parents' legal team. The article portrayed them as loving parents who had tried everything to help their troubled daughter, including paying for therapy and supporting her through law school, only to be repaid with false accusations and legal harassment. My refusal to comment for the story was interpreted as evidence of guilt, and the article included quotes from unnamed community members expressing shock that I would attack the family that gave me everything. The psychological impact of this sustained assault on my character and reputation brought me to the lowest point of my adult life. There were moments, usually late at night in that lonely hotel room, when I seriously considered withdrawing from the case and disappearing back to Chicago where I could rebuild my life in anonymity. The weight of being portrayed as the villain in a story where I was trying to seek justice for victims felt unbearable. I began questioning not just my motives but my sanity, wondering if maybe I really was the bitter, vindictive daughter they were painting me as. The breaking point came when I arrived at my hotel room one evening to find it had been ransacked. Nothing was stolen, but every piece of clothing had been cut up, my laptop had been smashed, and "crazy" was written across the bathroom mirror in red lipstick. The hotel manager apologized but mentioned that the security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned that afternoon. When I called the police, the responding officer suggested that maybe I should consider whether continuing with the case was worth the stress it was causing everyone involved. That night, sitting on the hotel bed surrounded by my destroyed belongings, I called my law school mentor Professor Martinez for the first time in years. I broke down completely, telling him everything about the case, the harassment, and my doubts about whether I was strong enough to see it through. His response was exactly what I needed to hear. "Haley, the fact that they're working so hard to destroy you means you're over the target. Innocent people don't launch character assassination campaigns, they defend themselves with facts." His words reminded me that my parents' desperate attacks on my credibility were actually evidence of their guilt and fear. The conversation with Professor Martinez helped me realize that I'd been playing defense when I should have been playing offense. Instead of just enduring their attacks and hoping the evidence would speak for itself, I needed to take control of the narrative and expose their tactics for what they were. The next morning, I called a press conference to address the harassment campaign directly, and to refocus attention on the real victims of my parents' crimes. It was time to stop being the target and start being the prosecutor again. The press conference I called was a calculated risk that could have either validated my credibility or confirmed my parents' narrative about my mental state. Standing in front of the Cedar Falls Community Center with local and regional media present, I made the decision to address their character assassination campaign head-on, while redirecting focus to their victims. I laid out the timeline of harassment I'd endured since beginning the investigation, not to gain sympathy, but to demonstrate the desperate lengths my parents were going to avoid accountability for their crimes. The breakthrough in my case came from an unexpected source and revealed the fourth layer of my parents' criminal enterprise. David Park, the accountant who had been handling Thompson Development's books for the past 5 years, had been watching the news coverage with growing discomfort about his own role in their operations. When he saw me standing at that podium, facing down the community's hostility while maintaining my professional composure, he made the decision to contact the FBI with information that would crack the case wide open. Park's testimony revealed that my parents hadn't just been running a Ponzi scheme. They'd been systematically bribing local officials to overlook zoning violations, tax discrepancies, and building code issues that should have shut down their operations years earlier. The county assessor, 2 city council members, and the building inspector had all been receiving monthly payments disguised as consulting fees. This corruption network explained how Thompson Development had been able to operate with impunity for so long despite numerous red flags that should have triggered investigations. The discovery of the bribery scheme led to my first major alliance in the fight against my parents. FBI agent Sarah Chin had been investigating similar fraud networks throughout the Midwest and immediately recognized the patterns in the Thompson case. Her experience with family-based criminal enterprises proved invaluable, both for understanding the psychological dynamics at play and for anticipating my parents' next moves. Agent Chin became not just a professional partner, but a crucial source of emotional support during the darkest phases of the investigation. My parents' response to losing their accountant and facing federal conspiracy charges was to escalate their personal attacks to a level that crossed from harassment into outright stalking. They hired a private investigator named Tony Russo, a former police detective with a reputation for using questionable methods to dig up dirt on his targets. Within a week of Park's defection, Russo was following me everywhere, documenting my daily activities and interactions with an intensity that felt threatening rather than merely investigative. The psychological warfare reached a new level when I learned that my parents had destroyed every trace of my existence from their home. My childhood bedroom had been converted into a home office, with all my photos, awards, and personal belongings either thrown away or donated to charity. When neighbors mentioned seeing a dumpster full of what looked like my childhood possessions, I realized this wasn't just about erasing evidence of their crimes. It was about erasing me from their family history entirely. The message was clear. If I insisted on being their enemy, I would be treated as if I'd never been their daughter at all. The emotional impact of this erasure was devastating in ways I hadn't expected. Those childhood photos and keepsakes weren't just personal memories. They were proof that there had once been love and genuine family bonds before everything became corrupted by greed and criminality. Losing them felt like losing the last remnant of the innocent girl who had once believed her parents were good people. The grief I felt was similar to mourning a death, except the people I was mourning were still alive and actively trying to destroy me. My salvation came from an unexpected source when Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, one of the elderly victims of my parents' scheme, reached out to offer her support. At 83 years old, she had lost her entire life savings to Thompson Development, but had been following the case with keen interest. Her phone call to my hotel room was brief but powerful. "Young lady, I may not know you personally, but I know good people when I see them, and you're fighting for what's right. Don't let them break you." Her words carried the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose by speaking the truth. Mrs. Hoffman's support opened the door to connections with other victims who had been afraid to speak out publicly for fear of retaliation from my parents. These conversations revealed the full scope of the emotional damage my parents had inflicted, not just through their financial crimes, but through their manipulation of the community's trust. Elderly couples who had lost their homes were being blamed by neighbors who still believed Thompson Development was legitimate. Families were being torn apart by arguments over whether to support the investigation or defend the Thompsons' reputation. The decision to make the victims' stories public was both strategic and moral. By organizing a press conference where Mrs. Hoffman and other victims could speak directly to the media, I shifted the narrative from a family feud to a community crisis. Their testimonies about lost retirement savings, foreclosed homes, and shattered trust were far more powerful than any legal argument I could make. The image of my parents as pillars of the community began to crumble when faced with the reality of their victims' suffering. The victims' press conference had an immediate impact on community opinion, and my parents' defense strategy. Local support for them began to waver as residents realized that their neighbors, people they'd known for decades, had been genuinely harmed by the Thompsons' actions. The narrative of a vindictive daughter pursuing a family vendetta became much harder to maintain when respected community members were demanding justice for documented financial crimes. For the first time since returning to Cedar Falls, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle entirely alone. The fifth betrayal was the one that nearly destroyed my faith in justice entirely, because it revealed the true depth of my parents' criminal calculation. During the discovery phase of the federal case, forensic accountants uncovered evidence that my parents had been systematically embezzling from my own trust fund for over a decade. The college fund that my grandparents had established for me, worth over $200,000, had been gradually drained to fund their lifestyle and their Ponzi scheme operations. The documentation showed that the theft had begun even before my confrontation with them during law school. While I'd been celebrating my academic achievements and feeling grateful for their support, they'd been stealing money that was legally mine to pay for their country club memberships, luxury vacations, and expensive cars. The financial hardship I'd endured while working 3 jobs to pay for my education could have been avoided entirely if they hadn't stolen the funds that were intended for exactly that purpose. Even more devastating was the discovery that my parents had used my identity to secure fraudulent loans worth nearly $500,000. My social security number had been used to open credit cards, secure personal loans, and even obtain a mortgage on a property I'd never seen. The credit damage from these activities had been affecting my financial life for years without my knowledge, explaining why I'd been denied a car loan in Chicago, and why my credit card applications were often rejected despite my steady income and responsible financial behavior. My brother Jake's full involvement in the family's criminal enterprise was revealed through wiretapped phone conversations between him and our parents. Not only had he known about the theft from my trust fund, but he'd been the one who suggested using my identity for the fraudulent loans. His voice on those recordings, casually discussing how to forge my signature, and which of my personal information would be most useful for their schemes, destroyed any remaining hope I'd had for salvaging our sibling relationship. The most vicious attack came when my parents, facing mounting evidence and dwindling options, decided to claim that I was attempting suicide for attention. They contacted local news outlets with a fabricated story about receiving concerning phone calls from me where I'd allegedly threatened to harm myself if they didn't confess to crimes they insisted they hadn't committed. This lie was designed to accomplish multiple goals: discrediting my mental state, generating sympathy for them as worried parents, and potentially forcing a psychiatric evaluation that could delay or derail the prosecution. The forced psychiatric evaluation was arranged through Dr. Williams, the family physician who had treated me throughout childhood, and who had apparently been compromised by years of accepting payments from my parents for writing fraudulent medical reports. The evaluation took place in a sterile hospital room, where I was questioned about my motivations for pursuing the case, my emotional stability, and whether I was receiving proper mental health treatment. The entire process was designed to create documentation that could be used to argue that I was not competent to serve as prosecutor. Sitting in that hospital room, answering questions designed to make me appear unstable, while knowing that the man evaluating me was being paid by my parents, I came closer to giving up than at any other point in the ordeal. The isolation was complete. My parents had turned the community against me, my brother had betrayed me, my identity had been stolen, and now even my mental health was being weaponized against me. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had treated me as nothing more than a useful tool when I served their purposes and a dangerous enemy when I threatened their interests. The breaking point came during the psychiatric evaluation when Dr. Williams asked me why I couldn't just forgive and forget, for the sake of family harmony. His question revealed the fundamental corruption of everyone around my parents, the way they'd normalized criminal behavior by framing it as a family matter rather than a federal crime. In that moment, I realized that my parents hadn't just stolen money from their victims. They'd stolen the moral foundation of everyone who had enabled their behavior. My recovery from this lowest point began with a phone call from Professor Martinez, who had been monitoring the situation from Chicago and recognized the psychiatric evaluation for what it was: a desperate attempt to silence me through medical intimidation. His outrage on my behalf reminded me that there were still people in the world who valued truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty. His promise to fly to Iowa to support me through the remainder of the case gave me the strength to refuse the medication Dr. Williams was trying to prescribe, and to demand a second opinion from an independent psychiatrist. The independent evaluation, conducted by Dr. Sarah Foster from the University of Iowa's Psychology Department, not only cleared me of any mental health issues, but documented the psychological abuse I'd been subjected to by my family and their associates. Her report described the harassment campaign, identity theft, and forced evaluation as a systematic attempt to discredit a crime victim through medical intimidation. This documentation became crucial evidence of my parents' willingness to abuse their position and connections to silence opposition. The decision to fight harder rather than retreat came from recognizing that my parents' escalating attacks were actually evidence of their desperation and guilt. Innocent people don't orchestrate character assassination campaigns, steal their daughter's identity, or force psychiatric evaluations on prosecutors. Their behavior had moved far beyond normal legal defense into criminal obstruction of justice, and each action they took to silence me actually strengthened the case against them. I realized that backing down now would not only betray the victims who were counting on me for justice, but would also enable my parents to continue their criminal behavior with impunity. The transformation from victim to prosecutor required accepting some painful truths about the family I'd once loved and the community I'd grown up in. My parents weren't fundamentally good people who had made mistakes. They were calculating criminals who had manipulated everyone around them, including their own children, to serve their selfish interests. The community wasn't just deceived by their lies. Many residents were willfully ignorant because challenging the Thompsons' reputation would force them to confront their own complicity in enabling criminal behavior. The alliance with forensic accountant Michael Brennan marked the turning point where the investigation shifted from defensive to offensive. Brennan, who had built his reputation dismantling complex financial fraud schemes throughout the Midwest, brought a level of expertise that my parents hadn't anticipated when they'd constructed their criminal enterprise. His analysis revealed layers of deception that went far beyond the obvious Ponzi scheme, including shell companies, offshore accounts, and a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been moving stolen funds through multiple states. Brennan's investigation uncovered the true scope of my parents' criminal network, which extended far beyond Cedar Falls and involved co-conspirators in 3 other states. Thompson Development was just the public face of an operation that included fake construction companies, fraudulent investment firms, and even a bogus charity that had been soliciting donations for disaster relief while pocketing the money. The scheme was so complex that it took Brennan's team 3 weeks just to create a flow chart showing how money moved between the various entities my parents controlled. The discovery of the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands provided the smoking gun evidence that this wasn't a case of mismanaged investments or accounting errors, but deliberate fraud with sophisticated planning for concealing stolen assets. My parents had been moving money out of the country for over 5 years, creating a financial escape plan that they could activate if their scheme was ever discovered. The fact that they'd obtained false passports under assumed names indicated they'd been prepared to flee the country and abandon their victims entirely. Dorothy Walsh, who led the county's senior advocacy group, became an unexpected but powerful ally when she realized that many of her organization's members had been targeted by my parents' scheme. Walsh had known my parents socially for over 20 years, and had initially been skeptical of the allegations against them. But her investigation into complaints from her group's members revealed a pattern of targeting that was too systematic to be coincidental. My parents had deliberately sought out vulnerable elderly residents who lacked family support or financial expertise. The support from Dorothy Walsh opened doors to victims who had been afraid to come forward because they feared being blamed for their own victimization. Many elderly residents felt ashamed that they'd fallen for what seemed obvious in hindsight, and my parents had exploited this shame by suggesting that going to the authorities would only result in public humiliation. Walsh's credibility and her organization's support gave these victims the courage to share their stories and contribute to the growing mountain of evidence against Thompson Development. My parents' 6th major attack was an attempt to have me disbarred through false ethics complaints filed with the Illinois State Bar Association. The complaints, filed by anonymous sources but clearly orchestrated by Marcus Webb's legal team, alleged that I had conflicts of interest in prosecuting my own family, that I'd made public statements prejudicial to my parents' right to a fair trial, and that I was using my position as a federal prosecutor to pursue personal vendettas. Each complaint required a formal response and investigation, creating additional stress and distraction during the most critical phase of preparing for trial. The ethics investigation forced me to confront the legitimate concerns about prosecuting my own family, while also defending against fabricated allegations designed to derail my career. The Illinois Bar's investigation was thorough and ultimately vindicated my professional conduct, but the process was emotionally draining and strategically disruptive. Every hour I spent responding to ethics complaints was an hour I couldn't spend building the criminal case against my parents, which was exactly the delay tactic Webb had intended. The breakthrough that secured our prosecution came from an unexpected source: my parents' own arrogance and criminal hubris. Believing that their harassment campaign had broken my resolve, and that their political connections would protect them, they made the critical mistake of attempting to bribe me through an intermediary. County Commissioner Frank Morrison, who had been receiving payments from Thompson Development for years, approached me with an offer of $2 million in exchange for dropping the federal charges and accepting a civil settlement that would have allowed my parents to keep most of their stolen assets. The bribery attempt was exactly the evidence we needed to demonstrate that my parents' criminal behavior was ongoing and that they had no intention of taking responsibility for their actions. I immediately contacted Agent Chun, who arranged for me to wear a recording device during subsequent meetings with Morrison. The recordings captured not just the bribery offer but detailed discussions of how the money would be paid, which offshore accounts it would come from, and what my parents expected in return for their payment. The final phase of evidence gathering required coordinating testimony from over 50 witnesses, including victims, co-conspirators who had agreed to cooperate, and expert witnesses who could explain the complex financial mechanisms my parents had used to conceal their crimes. Each witness had to be prepared for aggressive cross-examination by Webb's defense team, which would undoubtedly focus on attacking their credibility, their memory, and their motives for cooperating with the prosecution. The most challenging aspect of preparing for trial was maintaining my professional objectivity, while dealing with the personal trauma of prosecuting my own family. The evidence we'd gathered told the story of people I'd once loved and trusted revealing themselves to be calculating predators who had victimized not just their community, but their own daughter. Processing this reality while building a legal case required a level of emotional compartmentalization that sometimes made me feel like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. The week before trial began, all the evidence was finally assembled into a comprehensive case that demonstrated the full scope of my parents' criminal enterprise. The financial records showed over $4 million in stolen assets, forged documents bearing my signature that I'd never signed, recordings of bribery attempts, and testimony from victims whose lives had been destroyed by people they'd trusted. The case was stronger than I'd ever dared hope it would be, but presenting it in court would require confronting the two people who had given me life and then systematically tried to destroy it. The first day of the trial brought a moment I'd been preparing for emotionally and professionally for months. Standing before Judge Morrison and delivering an opening statement that would lay out my parents' crimes with the clinical precision required of a federal prosecutor, while knowing that every word was destroying what remained of my family. The courtroom was packed with community members, victims, media representatives, and court officials who had come to witness what many were calling the most significant criminal case in the county's history. My opening statement was structured to systematically dismantle the image my parents had cultivated over decades, while presenting the mathematical evidence of their criminal enterprise. I began with the numbers. $4 million stolen from over 200 victims, 12 years of systematic fraud, and a criminal conspiracy that had corrupted local government officials and violated federal banking laws. The stark recitation of facts was designed to establish immediately that this was not a family dispute or a civil matter, but a serious federal crime with victims throughout the state. The first phase of our case focused on establishing the mechanics of the Ponzi scheme through the testimony of victims, who could explain how they'd been targeted and manipulated. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman's testimony was particularly powerful because she could articulate not just the financial losses, but the emotional betrayal of trusting people she'd considered friends. Her description of my parents' sales tactics revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation they'd used to convince elderly residents to invest their life savings in fake development projects. Mrs. Hoffman's cross-examination by Marcus Webb was aggressive, but ultimately backfired because his attempts to portray her as confused or vindictive only emphasized her dignity and credibility. When Webb suggested that she was simply a bitter old woman who couldn't accept responsibility for making bad investments, she responded with the clarity and strength that had made her such an effective witness. "Mr. Webb, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I trusted people I thought were honest, and they stole my money. That's not a bad investment, that's theft." The second witness, Mr. Rodriguez, my former high school math teacher, provided devastating testimony about how my parents had specifically targeted him because of his connection to me. His testimony revealed that they had used my academic achievements and their pride in my legal career as selling points when convincing him to invest. The fact that they'd exploited their own daughter's reputation to defraud someone who had been important to her education demonstrated the depth of their manipulation and disregard for anyone else's well-being. David Park's testimony as the government's key witness required 3 days because of the complexity of the financial records he'd maintained and the extensive cross-examination by the defense team. Park's detailed explanation of how money moved through the various accounts, shell companies, and offshore entities painted a picture of sophisticated criminal planning that contradicted any claims that this was simply mismanaged business operations. His testimony also revealed the systematic nature of the record falsification and document forgery that had concealed the crimes for so many years. The presentation of forged documents bearing my signature was one of the most emotionally challenging moments of the trial for me personally. Seeing my name and signature attached to investment agreements, loan applications, and business contracts that I'd never seen before forced me to confront the reality that my parents had been using my identity for criminal purposes, even when I'd thought we had a loving family relationship. The handwriting analysis expert's testimony confirmed that while some signatures were genuine from my early legal consultations, dozens of others had been forged with increasing sophistication over time. My parents' reaction to the evidence against them was telling in its complete lack of surprise or denial about the facts being presented. Rather than appearing shocked by allegations that they might have considered false, they seemed focused primarily on the legal strategy for minimizing their consequences. Their body language and whispered conversations with their attorney suggested people who were concerned about being caught rather than people who were confused about being accused of crimes they hadn't committed. The community members who filled the courtroom each day were witnessing the systematic destruction of their image of the Thompson family as pillars of local society. Many residents had come expecting to see a vindictive daughter pursuing frivolous charges against loving parents, but the evidence being presented was forcing them to confront the reality that they'd been deceived by people they'd trusted and admired. The shift in public opinion was visible in the changing composition of the courtroom audience, as supporters of my parents gradually stopped attending while victims and their families became more numerous. The defense's strategy became clear during their cross-examinations. They weren't trying to disprove the financial crimes because the evidence was too overwhelming, but rather to argue that my parents were the real victims of ambitious subordinates who had manipulated them into criminal activity. Webb's questions consistently focused on portraying my parents as trusting business owners who had been taken advantage of by sophisticated fraudsters, despite the clear evidence that they had been the architects and primary beneficiaries of the scheme. The first week of trial established a pattern that would continue throughout the prosecution. Each piece of evidence presented was more damaging than the defense team had anticipated, and their attempts to explain away the crimes only highlighted the systematic nature of the criminal activity. The mathematical precision of the fraud, the sophistication of the money laundering, and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable victims all contradicted any narrative of accidental wrongdoing or victimization by subordinates. The emotional toll of presenting this case was partially offset by the growing support from the community as residents realized the true scope of my parents' crimes and the courage it had taken to prosecute them. Former friends who had initially shunned me began attending the trial and expressing regret for believing my parents' lies about my mental state and motives. The validation of my decision to pursue justice was meaningful, but it couldn't completely heal the wounds caused by my family's betrayal and the community's initial rejection. The climactic moment of the trial came when my parents made the strategic decision to testify in their own defense, despite the obvious risks of subjecting themselves to cross-examination with such overwhelming evidence against them. Marcus Webb had apparently calculated that their only hope was to present themselves as sympathetic figures who had been manipulated by subordinates and betrayed by their own daughter. The decision would prove to be the final mistake in a criminal enterprise built on underestimating the intelligence and determination of their victims. My father took the stand first, presenting himself as a hard-working businessman who had trusted the wrong people and made poor decisions, but had never intended to hurt anyone. His direct examination was carefully choreographed to portray him as a small-town entrepreneur who had gotten in over his head with complex financial arrangements he didn't fully understand. Webb's questions were designed to elicit sympathy for a man who had supposedly been victimized by sophisticated criminals who had taken advantage of his trusting nature. The cross-examination I conducted was the moment I'd been preparing for throughout my entire legal career, though I'd never imagined it would involve questioning my own father about crimes he'd committed against people I'd grown up with. My approach was methodical and unemotional, focusing on the documentary evidence that contradicted every aspect of his testimony. When he claimed ignorance about offshore accounts, I presented bank records showing he'd personally opened them. When he denied knowledge of forged documents, I showed him emails he'd sent with detailed instructions about which signatures to copy. The most devastating moment came when I played the recording of his attempted bribery through Commissioner Morrison. His voice was clearly identifiable as he discussed how much money I would accept to drop the charges, and which accounts the payment would come from. The recording destroyed any remaining credibility for his claims of innocence, and revealed the calculating criminal mind behind the folksy small-town businessman persona he'd presented to the jury. My mother's testimony was even more disastrous for their defense because she was less skilled at maintaining lies under pressure, and more emotionally volatile when confronted with evidence. Her direct examination attempted to portray her as a devoted wife who had simply supported her husband's business decisions without understanding their illegal nature. Webb's questions emphasized her community involvement and charitable work, trying to create sympathy for a woman who had supposedly been an innocent victim of her husband's poor judgment. During cross-examination, my mother's composure cracked completely when I presented her with evidence of her direct involvement in targeting elderly victims. Email records showed her personally researching potential victims' financial situations, family structures, and psychological vulnerabilities to determine who would be most susceptible to their investment schemes. When confronted with an email where she'd referred to victims as easy marks and discussed how to squeeze more money out of the old folks, she broke down completely. The complete breakdown on the witness stand was painful to watch, even knowing everything they'd done to me and their victims. The woman who had once been my mother sobbed uncontrollably, while admitting to crimes that had destroyed dozens of families' financial security. Her emotional collapse was genuine, but it was grief for herself and her situation rather than remorse for the pain she'd caused others. The jury could see the difference between self-pity and genuine repentance, and their faces reflected disgust rather than sympathy. The surprise testimony from my brother Jake was the result of a last-minute plea agreement his attorney had negotiated in exchange for his cooperation against our parents. Jake's testimony revealed details about the family's criminal operations that even the FBI investigation hadn't uncovered, including additional victims, hidden assets, and plans for fleeing the country if they were ever indicted. His decision to testify against our parents was motivated entirely by self-preservation rather than conscience, but his inside knowledge was crucial for demonstrating the premeditated nature of their crimes. Jake's testimony also revealed the psychological dynamics within our family that had enabled the criminal behavior to continue for so many years. He described how our parents had normalized illegal activity by framing it as smart business practices, and justified their actions by claiming that their victims were wealthy enough to absorb the losses. The entitlement and lack of empathy that characterized their worldview was perfectly captured in a quote Jake attributed to our father. "These old people are going to die soon anyway, and their kids will just waste the money." Judge Morrison's reaction to the evidence and testimony was one of barely controlled anger at the scope of the crimes and the defendant's complete lack of remorse. His judicial demeanor remained professional throughout the trial, but his questions during jury instructions and his comments about sentencing guidelines made clear that he viewed this case as representing a fundamental betrayal of community trust. The fact that he had known my family socially for decades only intensified his disgust at learning the truth about their criminal enterprise. The jury's deliberation lasted only 6 hours, which surprised no one who had followed the evidence presented during the trial. The overwhelming documentation of criminal activity, combined with my parents' disastrous testimony and complete lack of credible defense, made the verdict a foregone conclusion. When the jury foreman announced guilty verdicts on all counts, including fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, my parents showed no surprise, only resignation to consequences they had spent years trying to avoid. The community's reaction to the verdicts was a mixture of relief, anger, and embarrassment that they had been deceived for so long by people they had trusted and admired. Many residents expressed regret for initially supporting my parents and doubting the victims who had tried to warn others about Thompson Development's suspicious practices. The trial had forced the entire town to confront uncomfortable truths about their willingness to overlook warning signs when they came from people they didn't want to believe were capable of criminal behavior. The sentencing phase brought a measure of closure that I hadn't expected to feel, though it couldn't undo the years of emotional damage or restore the family relationships that had been destroyed by criminal behavior and betrayal. Judge Morrison sentenced my father to 15 years in federal prison and my mother to 12 years, with both sentences including provisions for full restitution to victims and forfeiture of all assets that could be traced to their criminal enterprise. The sentences were substantial enough to ensure that they would face real consequences for their crimes while still acknowledging their age and lack of prior criminal history. The immediate aftermath of the trial brought an outpouring of apologies and support from community members who recognized the courage it had taken to prosecute my own family and the justice I had secured for their victims. Former friends who had shunned me based on my parents' lies reached out to express their regret and admiration for my persistence in seeking truth despite personal cost. The validation was meaningful, though it couldn't completely heal the wounds caused by their initial willingness to believe I was mentally unstable rather than seeking justice. My decision to establish a victim support fund using the recovered assets was driven by a desire to ensure that the money stolen from elderly residents would be returned to help them rebuild their financial security, rather than simply disappearing into government accounts. Working with Dorothy Walsh and other community leaders, we created a foundation that not only provided direct financial assistance to victims, but also offered counseling services and legal advocacy for elderly residents who had been targeted by other financial predators. The conversation with my brother Jake about rebuilding our relationship revealed how differently we had responded to our parents' criminal behavior and the family dysfunction that had enabled it. While I had chosen to seek justice despite personal cost, he had chosen complicity and self-preservation until forced to cooperate by legal pressure. Our discussion was civil but made clear that trust between us could never be fully restored because of the choices he had made when faced with moral decisions about right and wrong. My growing relationship with Emma Foster, the local journalist who had covered the trial fairly and accurately, represented a new beginning based on honesty and shared values rather than family connections or social expectations. Emma's reporting had helped shift community opinion by focusing on victim stories rather than sensationalizing family drama, and her integrity during a difficult period had shown me that genuine relationships were possible with people who valued truth over comfort or convenience. The promotion to senior partner at my Chicago law firm came with an offer to head their new white-collar crime division, a position that would allow me to use the experience and expertise gained from prosecuting my parents to help other victims of financial fraud. The irony that my parents' crimes had inadvertently advanced my career, while destroying their own lives, was not lost on me. Though I took no satisfaction in their downfall, only in the justice secured for their victims. My periodic returns to Cedar Falls for victim support work and foundation activities allowed me to maintain connections with the community, while building a new identity separate from my family's criminal legacy. The work was personally fulfilling because it helped elderly residents protect themselves from future fraud, while also providing me with ongoing reminders of why the prosecution had been necessary despite its personal cost. Each person we helped validated the decision to seek justice rather than maintain family loyalty. The therapy sessions I began after the trial were crucial for processing the complex emotions surrounding my family's betrayal and my own role in bringing them to justice. Learning to separate my love for the people they had once been from my responsibility to stop the criminals they had become was a lengthy process that required professional guidance. The grief I felt was legitimate and necessary, even though their imprisonment was the result of choices they had made rather than some external tragedy. The personal growth that came from surviving this ordeal included a deeper understanding of the difference between family loyalty and enabling criminal behavior, the importance of speaking truth even when it's unwelcome, and the reality that love sometimes requires holding people accountable for harmful actions. These lessons informed not just my personal relationships, but also my professional approach to prosecuting crimes that involved family dynamics and community pressure to ignore or minimize criminal behavior. My new perspective on success and happiness was less focused on external validation or family approval, and more centered on personal integrity and meaningful work that helped protect vulnerable people from exploitation. The accomplishments I was most proud of were not the legal victories or career advancement, but the relationships I had built with victims who had found courage to seek justice, and the positive changes in how the community approached financial fraud prevention. The final reflection on my journey from beloved daughter to federal prosecutor revealed that sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to become what hurt you, choosing justice over vengeance, and truth over family loyalty when the two are in conflict. The people who had raised me had taught me valuable lessons about right and wrong, even though they had ultimately chosen to ignore those lessons when personal profit was at stake. My responsibility was to honor the good values they had taught me rather than enable the criminal behavior they had chosen to pursue. The ongoing work with victims of family financial abuse became a new purpose that gave meaning to the pain and betrayal I had experienced. Every elderly person we helped protect from fraud, every family we educated about warning signs of financial exploitation, represented a victory against the kind of criminal behavior my parents had engaged in. The work transformed my personal trauma into a tool for helping others avoid similar victimization. The question I'm often asked is whether I regret prosecuting my own parents, and my answer is always the same. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing what was right for their victims and for the community they had betrayed. Justice isn't about revenge or personal satisfaction. It's about protecting society from people who choose to harm others for personal gain. Sometimes that protection requires difficult choices about family loyalty versus moral responsibility. Looking back on this experience, I realized that the parents who raised me to value honesty, hard work, and helping others actually gave me the tools I needed to hold them accountable when they abandoned those values for criminal gain. The irony is that their own moral teachings became the foundation for their prosecution. In the end, I honored them more by stopping their criminal behavior than I would have by enabling it through silence or family loyalty. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing the right thing meant going against family expectations or community pressure? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how we balance loyalty with moral responsibility. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult situations. Share this video with anyone who might be facing similar challenges with family dynamics and moral decisions. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is holding people accountable for their actions. Your courage to speak truth, even when it's difficult, might be exactly what someone else needs to find their own strength.